I'm Lisa. I'm a chartered psychologist and psychotherapist, and I founded It's Time for Change, I think nearly 10 years ago, based on the fact that I'm really keen on helping people be the best they can be and helping workplaces get people right. When we get people right, we get business right. So that's kind of my premise. Roy, do you want to say a couple of words about yourself?
Thank you. Yes. Hello, everyone. My name is Roy Magara, and I'm an employment lawyer. Recently set up my own practice, Magara Law, based in Oxfordshire. And much like Lisa, people matter, we all matter. And topics like this are really important. They're really tangible. They're really current. And hopefully we'll be sharing some things today that can help everyone.
Can I just ask people who joined, if you wouldn't mind just putting yourself on mute. We are very happy. We're going to have time at the end for Q&A. So we'll have an opportunity for people to come off mute if they want to and to talk. But because of the numbers, background noise can just be really, really hard. So thank you ever so much for that. So today we're talking about psychological safety, and we know that we need our workforce to feel happy and engaged so that they can be really productive. We know personally what it feels like when we're criticised or we feel nervous about asking questions or being authentic, about how it kind of shuts us down. So we're focusing on this because when we get psychological safety right and we are enabling people to feel relaxed and to be themselves, then we know that people perform well, either as individuals or as teams in whatever setting they're in. So I'm going to be providing the psychological side of psychological safety, all that we can in the very short time we have. So this is going to be the real introduction to this. And Roy's going to be kind of bringing it to life with some case studies. So that's what we're going to be focusing on today. It's a big topic. This is just an introduction. Mute someone else. Sorry, I'm trying to multitask as well, which is going to be interesting. Yes, I get a couple of questions through saying this is it going to be recorded? It is being recorded. Thank you very much for that. It's to remind me to say we are recording this session. You will get access to the recording and the slides afterwards for your reference. So, Roy, if I forget anything, then do just chip in as well. Roy and I tend to have this as kind of we're very relaxed in how we do this. We want to be much more kind of an introduction, a bit of a chat about this quite big topic. It's very much a start of this conversation. So thinking to start with about what is psychological safety. It's not a new concept. The behaviours aren't new, but the way it's packaged is. So the terms, it's a bit of a buzz term at the moment. Lots of people are talking about psychological safety, but not necessarily knowing what it actually is. And it's a bit ambiguous because it's more of a construct than a definite thing you can hold on to and you can kind of look at and tick off. The key message through the whole of this session for me is not to overcomplicate it. This is all about being human. This is all about kind of human balance. So I'm just going through trying to mute people at the same time. And it's not a bolt-on. So when we're thinking about psychological safety, I know someone recently I spoke to said, oh yeah, we've got mental health first aiders, we're doing this thing on well-being, so now we think we ought to do psychological safety. It's almost like they're kind of grabbing at things as they're going to like a pick and mix option. It's not a bolt-on, it's kind of fundamental basis on which everything else should fit. So when we think about being human, there are four main areas that always stand out. That whole sense of being included. So we know that as human beings, we're programmed to feel like we fit in, to be looking for signs that we are accepted. You know, are people looking at us? Are they smiling at us? Are they nodding? Are they doing all that kind of thing? In terms of being safe to learn, we know that when we're trying to learn something, if we can really engage with it and focus on it, we learn well. If we're preoccupied with what people are going to think about what we do already know or don't know and how well we perform, that gets in the way of our learning. The safe to contribute, we know that we need to be able to contribute to group discussions, to what's going on, and to be able to challenge. And as leaders and managers, it's really important to be able to explain to people why they're doing what they're doing, why they need to do what they need to do, so that people understand the why. If they don't understand the why, it's a fundamental human need, then people are going to be unsure. And we need to then give people opportunities for people to be able to challenge and come up with their own ideas. So as a leader, you're explaining why, you're assigning what needs to happen. So in terms of, this is what we're about, this is what needs to happen, but the how is what you can then delegate to the people around you, so they have a sense of autonomy to be themselves. I think the point about psychological safety is that we know this has to happen. We know we need this in order for teams to be able to perform really well. So we know that as individuals, we can do our own thing in our own space, but actually when we come together and we're collaborating, there's a lot more strength in what we're able to produce in terms of our outcomes. The tricky thing with this is there is no textbook answer. So you could listen to podcasts, you could look at books, and people all talk about the same kind of themes. But in terms of how you put it into place in your workplace, that's down to you as a human being, and that's down to you as an individual and your own style. So what we're going to be going through today are some of the kind of tips about how to think about this. One thing that is clear to say is that it's a continuous process, and it's not something you can just tick off. So it's going to be, because it's essentially about you as a leader or manager being authentic and clearly demonstrating that when people are themselves, at the good, bad and ugly, that actually nothing bad happens, and that actually differences and challenges and questions and so on are celebrated. That's when we can achieve that, we know that we're going to keep evolving, because people will be providing different questions, or they'll be asking different questions, they'll be challenging, they'll be contributing, and that's a constantly evolving process. So it's critical as an organisation to get psychological safety right, and it all comes down to you and your part in leading it. So I want to invite you now to think about what it looks like for you. And in the chat box, I'd encourage you to think of three key words that describe a workplace culture where you feel safe. This does not have to be your work culture now, your workplace now. And when we come on to think about the not so safe one, you might not want to be sharing that anyway. But thinking about what three words come to mind when you think about a work environment at its best, where people can feel safe to contribute and question and to learn and so on. And it's no right or wrong answers in this, it's just kind of what comes to mind. And this is effectively going to be the number 10 on your scale. So we've got some suggestions coming through about people focus, collaboration, innovation. Absolutely. And you need to have psychological safety for people to be creative and innovative. And we need to be clear about what that looks like for us. And for you as an individual, you need to know what number 10 looks like. And the people around you need to know what number 10 looks like. And then in contrast to that, you need to be clear about what number 1 looks like. So when you think about the behaviours, the feelings that would be apparent in a workplace where people don't feel psychologically safe, they don't feel able to speak up when they don't know or they have a question, or they have a better idea or different perspective. They worry about judgment. There's that sense of fear. What does number 1 look like? And it's really important to start to identify those polar opposites, because only then can you start to actually assess where you are in terms of your organisation. So beginning to think about, okay, am I a 4? Am I a 7? What puts me at that number rather than the number before? What do we need to do in terms of getting ourselves to the next number on the scale? The question as well is, once you've identified where you think you're at, do you know where the people you work with, where they've put you in your organisation? And how do you know? Is that an assumption you've got that I'm sure they put me at an 8, or me, our company at an 8? Do you know that for sure? What would other people say about, your clients, stakeholders? What would they say about where your company's at? And how do you know? And does it match where you think you are? So it's beginning to have clarity around that sense of where you are now, where you want to be, and then beginning to identify what the next steps are. And I think it's the one thing that's really important that's coming through with some work I'm doing with the NHS at the moment, and I'm doing lots of interviewing of some of leaders about what pulls, what gives them a sense of team and identity and so on. And actually the sense of purpose and sense of team vision is so important, because when everyone has a shared sense of purpose, a shared vision, a shared sense of, this is why we're here, this is why we're doing what we're doing, this is how we're working together, actually means you start to collaborate much more, and that's when you have the real connection, and that's what pulls people together. I think as leaders sometimes we can get very fixed on identifying what the people's differences are, and actually this person's great at that, this person's great at that, they're different, they're not so good. Actually we need to work out what's the glue holding everyone together. So thinking about what cultivates it, number one is relationships, and it's the one thing that tends to get pushed aside when we're busy. So I think, it's the conversation I have most with companies is around prioritizing relationships. And I think with remote working, which obviously a lot of people are engaged with now and will be for the foreseeable future for many, we need leadership to go from kind of this standardized approach, because we can see everyone, to a very personal approach, which means that how we engage with people will be different depending on the particular members of our team. But the quality of the relationships is absolutely fundamental, and that's the bit we have to get right. So it's about, if you think about, for example, conversations, they've got to be frequent, they've got to be really good quality, they've got to be formal and informal, and short and frequent check-ins are better than sort of having once a month formal meeting with someone, because it's touching base. And the conversations I've been having with people recently, I think they want more touch points, they just want just people to check in. And so having deliberately in those conversations, deliberately inviting people's views, deliberately inviting people to challenge what's their idea. When you're having staff briefings and updates, rather than that being very transactional, giving information, asking what people's fears are, asking where people are at, what are their challenges right now, what are their questions, and inviting that. If you don't invite it, you're not necessarily going to get it. So you need to be aware of it. Curiosity, avoid giving the answers all the time, because I think as leaders and managers, we tend to have this view of, this is what we've got to do, and this is the direction we need to go in. It's very easy to say, right, this is what happen, this is how. And actually what we need to be able to do is to say, I'm curious, tell me more about that, or tell me how you came to that view, and actually asking for people's uncertainties. What do they think? What do they think is a good point? What do they think is not working so well, or potentially such a good idea? You also need to be the sounding board, a safe space. So if someone's got an idea or something they're not quite sure about, that they can come to you and they feel that they can be honest and offload without any form of judgment or fear. And that sense of almost treating you as a safe space, that they can just experiment a little bit with their thinking and with their development of their role, or working with a particular client, whatever they might be doing. Also, a tricky one for some people about admitting your mistakes, and actually making a point of mistakes being learning opportunities. So rather than there being a sense of fault or blame, actually just seeing that, and particularly by modeling your own responses to your mistakes and modeling to other people what other people's your response to other people's mistakes, is it really helps people feel safe that actually making mistakes are treated as something positive that we learn from, rather than that sense of shame. We need clarity. If we're going to be working together and connecting and having those really good relationships, we need clarity about what everyone else's roles are and how we work together and what our shared vision and purpose is. And it's amazing how many teams I've worked with who don't know that. They don't know what really that person who sits doing that role, what they do, what they find, what they spend their time doing, what they're finding challenging, how you might actually be working with the same client, but they don't know what their purpose is. Thinking about feedback, you need to have that sense of how we feedback, which is in a safe way, and we all need feedback. So some people, well, I'll speak to and say, actually, I'm someone who's, I'm quite sorted. I can just get on with, I don't care what people think. I just get on, do my own thing. But actually, as human beings, we are social creatures. We all need that sense of, are we doing an okay job? The first question that people ask once they've done any, I don't know, delivering a project or delivering training, whatever, is how did I do? Did it go okay? Was it what you wanted? We all need that. I'll be asking the same question to Roy after this. We all need that sense of, is, are we along the right tracks? And sometimes we won't be quite along the right tracks, and that's okay to admit that, and to have that feedback as long as it's done well. And once we have a model for feedback that everyone understands and everyone supports, then it means that people can be held accountable to that. So actually, if someone speaks in quite a negative way or critical way, or in a way that doesn't feel very positive in terms of feedback, we can bring them back to, well, actually, this is what we agreed, and that felt a bit personal, and thinking about your language that doesn't feel like you're pointing your finger and wagging it at people. So that really helps people feel safe. So in terms of achievements, how do people know they're valued? How do people know that what they do is recognized? And there's such obvious questions in a way, which is why, I said right at the start, this is not new. These behaviors are not new, but they're so overlooked. And there's so much emphasis now on well-being and mental health and so on, but actually our culture in terms of who we are and how we can be is got to be number one. And if we don't know that we're doing a good job, we don't know that we are valued, we don't know that our achievements have been recognised, how are we supposed to feel motivated, engaged, and part of our team of people? And obviously all this comes to trust, and that's a whole different session in itself. We could talk for an hour or more about that. But we know that for trust, thinking about being a leader, thinking about being a manager, we need credibility. So you need to be aware of how you're coming across. And that comes back to psychological safety. It's all about how you model, how authentic you are. We need to be competent as leaders. So making sure that you're following through with what you say, doing what you say you're going to do, because otherwise that undermines everything. Asking the right kinds of questions. And then compatibility. So what is your rapport like? What are your relationships like? And it'd be really interesting then to get feedback about those kinds of things from your team around you, and asking them what they think. Some pitfalls to avoid. Don't be perfect, because being human, as a leader or as a manager, you are also human, or most of you, and I think that's where we tend to think we've got to get everything right, it's got to be sorted, and actually it's not. That sense of being able to say, I'm going to try something new, it didn't work out, I've got this plan, I'm not sure about it. Being authentic, and making sure that you're aware you're not demanding things from people, but you're cultivating psychological safety. You can't tell people to behave in a particular way. You've got to model it and be authentic for people to be able to follow that on. Recognizing cultural differences as well, because some people won't feel okay about speaking up and challenging in front of other people. So you might have more conversations sort of one-to-one. Oh, sorry, I clicked a button too quickly. And I want to just say about stress and fatigue. I think that's when we see our real character come through. So it's very much easier to think about psychological safety when we are calm and we're in a great space and we've got time to kind of reflect. When we're under the kind of pressure of, I've got tight deadlines and we're all stressed and we're all feeling slightly frazzled, that's when it really puts us to the test. And that's when we need to be able to step back and recognise our own stress and be able to take ownership and responsibility for that, and that of our colleagues as well. And that's about training for them. So just in terms of some of the musts, in terms of your team, thinking about one-to-ones and group meetings and so on, it's about being consistent and letting go of control. So letting go of that sense of I've got to be in control. Like I said earlier on, it's letting other people work out how to do things. And using your sense of humour, or finding a sense of humour, and your own flaws, your own mistakes, the things that you're not so great at. And being, that whole needing to learn, that sense of not knowing everything, you've got to try things out. Reality is, I was just saying to Roy at the start of this, or it might have been Karen actually, I was doing some training once, and I'm upstairs in my house, and I had suddenly a window clean. I started to clean the window right next to me, and I had these mops going, the rest of it, and I was trying to ignore it, And I was thinking, oh my gosh, why am I trying just to be really super professional? It's like, the reality is I've got dog barking, a window cleaner going, Roy's had his daughter sitting on his knee during a session. It's our reality. And when we can be honest about that, it means we can just relax, take that big issue out of the way and focus on what we're there to do. We know that we need to be mindful and sensitive to people's fears, which can come across as resentment. People say they're resenting this change, or they're being negative, they're resisting, and actually they're just scared, they're fearful. And when we listen and we ask people's fears and we ask for people's questions and their ideas, then we get an insight. And I think when we tend to ignore that and we just hope for the best, and we think we don't want to hear people's challenges, we don't want to hear what they don't like about my plan, you will hear about it whether you like it or not. You'll just hear about it through people's behavior. You'll hear about it through outcomes not being so great. So it's actually better to hear about it up front and be able to work through them first. Being solution focused, we all know focusing on solutions is much better than problems. But that kind of links in as well with the breaking down hierarchical boundaries. And I think some people with psychological safety get a bit stuck with that sense of, I don't feel confident speaking to that person because they know more than me, or that person's more senior, or that person's been here for longer. And it's about, some companies use mentoring, two-way mentoring and so on, which really helps overcome that and helps people to feel a bit more familiar with what other people do and a bit more accepted in terms of who they are and what they do. So there's lots of different ways that you can go around that. So just to finish off from my point of view, is thinking about the vision. What environment do you want to experience as an individual? So forget the kind of the right answer. As an individual, personally, what do you want to experience when you work? What feels good for you? And then how do you communicate that and develop that with your colleagues, with your team, your wider team? And how are you going to focus on that with intention? So for example, in meetings, how are you going to make sure that you are creating that culture of psychological safety, which takes specific planning rather than just hoping it's going to happen? And that goes with accountability. You have to work on yourself first. You have to be very confident and comfortable with all this before you can expect it of other people. And that means that you need to think, what do you need to stop doing? What do you need to do less of? What do you obviously need to continue with, do more of, and what do you need to start? And being aware of what gets in the way. And sometimes for leaders, it's their own sense of need for control or their own ego. Sometimes it's that perception that I'm supposed to be this type of person. Actually get rid of all the I'm supposed to be. Just being authentic breaks down a lot of barriers and starts to create psychological safety. I'm going to stop there and pause and hand over to Roy to pick up on some of the points.
Super. Thank you so much, Lisa, for all of that. And everyone here, you're welcome to, of course, save your questions till the end, or you're also welcome to put your questions in the chat too, and we'll pick up on them as we go along in the Q&A session at the end. So employment law, where on earth does employment law sit in all of this? I think it's probably is a misconception. And if I can admit, I actually thought it was a bit of a misconception too, in my own mind, thinking, how does employment law and psychology relate on this particular topic? But in actual fact, and as we're hopefully all seeing, employment law and psychology in this context actually aren't that alien from one another. If you think about psychological safety, then as a leader or as a manager or HR personnel in a company, you may not realize that your staff aren't speaking up, or that means that problems in that sense go unreported and unresolved. And the chances are that most of us here, or some of us, or at least our staff, have had an experience at work where they haven't asked a question that they really wanted to, or maybe they had an idea to suggest, but they stay quiet instead. And no matter where you may sit within your company's hierarchy, research shows that these sorts of silences are actually quite common, dangerously common, in fact. And a lot of studies seem to suggest that people seem to naturally hold back, in a sense, even when they believe that they might have a really good idea to share. And that is the unfortunate product of poor psychological safety, I should say, in the workplace. So from an employment law perspective, the losses from this silence are actually quite large because they're invisible. If you don't hear what people have to say, how are you going to know what you simply aren't ever going to know if someone doesn't communicate that to you? So those who fail to speak up, the individual themselves will then often regret that, usually for much longer than they might actually anticipate or realize at the time, and often wish for more fulfillment in their jobs. From a business perspective, silence means that problems perhaps go unresolved or opportunities to improve are missed. And in some cases, it might lead to significant failures that could have simply been avoided had there been better psychological safety. So these are some of the many reasons why this topic is really important. And I'm not going to go through the stats on the screen, but you can quite clearly see some of the, in my view, quite stark realities of our modern society. And that's why I wanted to just start off with this, just to get the one thing straight. You matter, the staff matter, people matter, and we need to continue to move away from just saying it or just believing it and keeping it to ourselves, but really putting that into our actions. And hopefully engaging in a webinar such as this one and taking on board some of the things that Lisa and I are talking about will hopefully help make this much more of a reality in our own mini worlds, as it were, and in our own workplaces. So if we then could please move on to the next slide, Lisa. Before we sort of jump into COVID, one other thing I just wanted to highlight is that silence in and of itself is intrinsically dangerous to a workplace. Employee engagement matters greatly because whatever your industry is, disengaged employees who remain silent potentially create risks and higher staff turnover, and no well-meaningful business ought to want that. Turnover means high recruiting and training costs, and again, any sensible business is not going to want that, but we appreciate it's much more than just finances here. So managers, unlike the one from KPMG, who I'll be talking about in just a moment, who appreciate the appeal of whether it's error reporting, so figuring out mistakes, encouraging their staff to ask for help, and other positive learning behaviors, may be concerned that fostering this kind of attitude means relaxing performance standards, but actually studies have shown that it's the converse that's true. So in fact, because psychological safety replaces silence and fear with openness, with candor, with honesty, with transparency in the workplace, it means that it's actually more conducive to set of more ambitious goals and improving well-being in the workplace. So managers who understand this deeply unsatisfying experience of keeping silent or being worried about what's going to happen in the workplace need to learn to recognize that and think about more positive changes. But what does that mean in a current COVID-19 world? Well, those of you who may recognize the image there concerning KPMG may recall that in February this year, the boss of KPMG stepped down, Bill Michael, and that was in response to protests from staff about his behavior during one rather infamous, I think it was Teams or Zoom online meeting. So he had, in effect, told his staff who had been sort of raising their concerns about their well-being, working from home and practices, etc., and mental health, and basically told them to stop moaning and told them that all of this unconscious bias malarkey was a load of nonsense, pretty much. Whereas, in fact, more and more companies ought to be engaging in things like this, in psychological safety and unconscious bias, the list goes on, in their workplaces. Needless to say, he wasn't there for very long, given the amount of protests that were raised. And although he apologized, his apology wasn't necessarily that sincere. And although the company then did an internal investigation, he left under a rather dark cloud into the wilderness, and that's that. But the focus isn't to focus on him, because in fact, there are plenty of leaders and managers who may view their staff in a similar light, who see their staff as incompetent just because they make a mistake, whatever that mistake might be, or not smart enough because they're not bringing too many ideas to the table, or the ideas that they're bringing just aren't hitting the mark. that's quite a damaging mindset to have. And I think the reality is that, and certainly I see it in practice, very much from the employee-related clients that I have, is that it does lead to higher turnover. It does lead to a higher percentage of low mental health. And it certainly leads to more employee disengagement. So this webinar has hopefully already sparked some desire and need for positive change here. So on a deeper level, when looking at COVID-19 and its impact on psychological safety at work, what does it look like in terms of the survival mode mentality that some employees might have? What do I mean by that? Well, during the crisis, rather, we know that organizations have had to make changes, understandably, whether it's to do with staff, redundancies, the list goes on in terms of what people do, furlough, etc. But what does that mean when survival in an employee's mindset becomes normal? And when does it fall on employers to pause and reflect about how those changes that they're making may affect their employees? Whether it's from having employees to use their own equipment, being at home, having to juggle home life, care, whether it's adult or child or pet or otherwise, or self-care, in fact. And so many employees have had to have a very much sort of all hands on deck approach, through no fault of their own in a sense per se, but have employers taken a moment just to pause about that, and as Lisa's been mentioning, about the reality of what the current circumstances look like. So we've all, and Lisa's mentioned her scenario, and I've alluded to mine too, in terms of care, etc., or things that go on in the background. We've all, in some way, shape, or form, been victim to the collateral responsibilities or things that happen in life. And it's a roller coaster for some people, certainly in this present day. So the question that leaders and managers need to ask themselves is, how long will my employees be willing to work in this way before I speak up or wake up to this really important topic? And when it comes to differences in experiences, so previously people working for an organization may all have had common experiences because you've all been in the pre-COVID world, all in the same place, all in the same workplace, sharing ideas, bouncing off one another, etc. But COVID-19 has, in the main, completely changed the scope of that, with most people working flexibly or remotely in some way. I suppose managers and leaders need to be alive to the fact that a number of their employees might have a fear of what their future looks like, and each of them will tackle that fear or prospect differently, depending on their own personalities and backgrounds, and the list goes on. So it's also been the case that there have been people who worked through lockdown, and there are those who've been put on furlough. And the reality is that those who may have been working through lockdown may have this sort of, well, everyone else has been at home and has been on furlough. Why on earth am I suffering this much? And those who've been on furlough might be thinking, oh gosh, what if there's going to be a redundancy or business reorganization? Where am I going to be? Am I going to suffer more so because I've been on furlough or not? Where do I sit in the future of my company? And equally, resentment might then build on either side. So communication in this instance is really important. It's easy to understand how these differing experiences can change psychological safety in the workplace. It's just a matter for managers and leaders, again, to have transparency and be open to feedback from their employees in this regard. So, what else to focus on? Lisa, kindly move on to the next slide. Thank you. So, got a number of things here for each of us to think about. And the first one here, and hopefully they're all somewhat self-explanatory just by reading them, but in terms of building a culture where mistakes are okay. And I'm going to try and give some practical examples from my own experience in terms of dealing with cases, what that might look like. So in terms of organizations looking to build a culture where mistakes are okay, I remind me of a case that I had recently where the client was, in short, blamed and eventually dismissed for suggesting, just in what she thought was a fairly standard conversation with one of her subordinates, next steps. This colleague had asked for advice in terms of what to do in a particular scenario. She said, well, in my view, I think it's best to do X, Y, and Z. And the company eventually, that came to the company's light, and eventually the company said, well, we wouldn't have advised you to do that, so we're going to suspend you, we're going to investigate. And she was eventually dismissed. Why? Well, they said, well, you've been here for at least 2 decades, and surely you should have known better that there were other options. Now imagine what the rippling effects of that are going to be in the company. Whoa, okay. So the longer I'm here, it's not a matter of loyalty. Actually, the longer I'm here, the less mistakes I'm allowed to make. It doesn't really foster much room for growth, much room for natural human error in companies. What I may humbly suggest is that the alternative perhaps to blame, even where a company might think that someone has legitimately made a mistake, whatever that might look like, isn't to go down the dismissal route, the suspension route, the hard hammer route, but perhaps to think about an alternative being something like curiosity. Perhaps asking more neutral questions like, okay, so in the past couple of months, I noticed a change in the quality of your work and progress appears to be slower than expected. I imagine there are a number of factors at play here. Shall we explore them together? Think about solutions. Okay, what are some positive outcomes that we can think about to move on from this point? And even you as a manager, HR, leader, what can I do to help you? That will certainly have a different spin in terms of your employees' engagement. And next, in terms of cultivating leaders' mindsets to be more receptive to feedback, I'm reminded of another case I had where an employee had conducted an internal investigation into the company, part of the employee's role. And when some things had come to light, the employee had then suggested these particular issues and incidents, and then gave some recommendations as far as change is concerned. The result was eventually this employee was dismissed, because in short, the company didn't want to hear what they heard and would have much rather saved cost and done things a different way rather than do things properly. Now, again, this employee will have left under a cloud, yes, but what does that say about the company? What does that say to other members of staff who would have been, whether it was in that board meeting or in that meeting where these things were said, and then in a matter of months, everything seemed to be a-okay, and all of a sudden this employee has gone. Now, we can't treat people like idiots here. Just because some neutral announcement goes out to the company doesn't necessarily mean that people won't start talking. So leaders and managers need to be open and be receptive to feedback here. We understand human beings. We perhaps naturally all hate losing more than winning, but this fallacy engineers unhealthy competition. It fosters poor criticism, and that in turn will breed disengagement and distrust. So how can we change this? Well, perhaps Lisa and I might suggest having in your minds the question, how can we achieve a mutually desired outcome? If someone provides me with feedback, they're not looking to bring me down, actually, or the company down. How can we achieve a mutually desired outcome, considering what this person has said? And when it comes to value, we perhaps may know, or may even have felt ourselves just being part of being a pawn in an organization. We may have all heard that in some way, shape, or form in our friendship circles, by the water cooler, etc. But underlying every team's who did what confrontation are universal needs of respect, of competence, no matter where you sit in terms of social status or background or gender, the list goes on. Everyone desires to be uniquely valued. And it's important for leaders and managers to recognize that natural instinct, because once we do so and we implement the kind of practical changes that Lisa was talking about earlier, then that will elicit naturally trust and promote positive language and change in our workplaces. So let's perhaps look to change our mindsets to something like, okay, this person has beliefs, perspectives, and opinions, just like I do. This person's got friends, families, perhaps children or other responsibilities or otherwise, just like I do. This person feels anxious, naturally vulnerable, hopes, aspirations, just like I do. This person wants to feel respected, valued, happy, at peace, just like I do. When we start to value people and show that we value them, it will certainly create much more positive psychological safety in our workplaces. So that being said, Lisa, perhaps you think it's time for us to jump to Q&A. We've got about 20 minutes worth of doing so. What do you think?
Yeah, definitely. So I'd like to open the floor up to putting questions in the chat box, and we will try and answer as many as we can. And if we'd like to people to come off mute, then we'll invite you to do that as well, because I know most people are on mute at the moment. But we'd like to hear what your questions are, and perhaps any reflections as well in terms of what we said, of what resonates with you in terms of your experience, because we've kind of summarised quite a lot in quite a short space of time.
Right. Lisa, if I may, I've seen a question in the chat box which is directed at you. If I may read it out, and then it's over to you. So someone's asked, okay, so perhaps more directed at Lisa, is whether it is believed that as people seem to work from home more, changes to the work environment post-COVID might affect psychological safety positively, negatively, or somewhere in between. What are your thoughts on that? I
think it goes back to as a point I made about, working from home means we need a really personal approach to building those relationships and working out, putting more effort in a way to creating psychological safety. Because as you were saying, Roy, when we're all physically in the space together, there's the small talk, there's the kind of chat, you can see how people are doing, because you can see people's reactions to what's being said, what's happening around them. And when people are at home, you don't know. And people's imaginations are, well, they're our most misused resource. So when people are stuck at home in their own little space without people around them to offer a naturally different perspective, and just, you're overhearing what other people are saying and seeing what other people are doing and seeing other people's struggles, it's very easy in your own little silo to think, I'm the only one struggling here, or I'm the only one who's got this question, and just feeling very exposed and feeling very vulnerable. So I think in a way that remote working culture that we're in now means that leaders and managers have to reach out even more and spend more time really building those relationships and that connection to reassure people, and finding different ways actually to model the mistakes, because the stuff we normally see, the mistakes that people make and how we respond to them, we're not automatically going to see that. So we need to find ways of consciously modeling when someone makes a mistake, actually, this is what we did, and telling people, and it's not going to happen so automatically. So I think it does take more effort now.
Thank you. And someone else asked about a lot of focus in organizations seem to be a lot about race and gender, and where does psychological safety fit in this in terms of safety for employees? Well, I think, as you rightly mentioned, Lisa, at the start, and as we've been alluding to in this conversation, it perhaps might be the case indeed that the media has really propagated things about race in particular, or gender. But psychological safety is across the board. It doesn't matter what gender you are, where you come from, your background, etc. We're all affected by it in some way, shape, or form, which is why Lisa and I are so pleased to see so many of you here really engaging in a really important topic that affects us all, whether we realize it or not.
And I just add to that as well, and Anna Harrington made a really good point earlier in the chat box about discrimination, that's potentially if someone's got a health issue, for example. And as you say, there are certain things that are in the media that people are more aware of, but there's a lot going on behind the scenes that people are not aware of. And a lot of people, whether it's mental health, physical health, whether it's the good old imposter syndrome, I'm not good enough to be doing my role, and I'm not good enough to be working in this company, or I should have the right answers. And we all have, each one of us has our own reality going on, whether it's just we didn't sleep well last night because we've got a baby, or I don't know what it is, but there's a reality. And when we can start to be authentic and say, this is what is going on for me right now. And when managers and leaders know of their team, what the people around them, what's going on for them right now, what are their challenges today, and today's challenges might be different from yesterday's challenges, which might be different to last week's challenges. But that's where the touch points are so important.
Quite right, I'm with you. How do we encourage a shift in culture when culture is not willing to change?
So I'm assuming, do we mean by the leadership's not willing to change then? Because obviously what you and I talked about, Roy, is about culture, and this is all about leadership has to model this and has to set the tone and create the space and the expectation that psychological safety is first and foremost, and that requires leadership leadership to be behind this and to value this. And it comes back to what you were saying, Roy, about valuing people. And I would, my personal view is, if your leadership, if you're working in a company and the people above you really don't have any value for psychological safety, they don't see the need for it. Or this is this kind of fluffy stuff. People just need to get on, get to work, be told what to do as well they can, and go home. I'd be looking for a different company to work in. Yeah, I don't know what you would add to that, Roy.
Yeah, certainly agree. That's when they end up emailing me or giving me a call to say, actually, I'm not happy with my employer and something needs to be done about that.
Yeah.
So yeah, those in many respects are the options, aren't they?
And I think that's an interesting one. I've done work before where it's slightly backfired on leadership who kind of will ask me to go and do some stuff around psychological safety or aspects of that. And then people suddenly realize that actually, yeah, they should be valued and they should be able to have a voice. And actually, I'm being told to be innovative, but I can't be innovative because that means I have to make mistakes. That's part of being creative and trying new things. And actually, I don't really like working here anymore. So they clear off. And actually, by the end of the piece of work, their workforce has gone down. But these people are really happily engaged somewhere else where they are valued. And I think that's where it comes back to. This all feeds into company reputation and what you were saying about staff turnover and so on. This, I think more and more see the outcomes or see the evidence of companies who treat people well and people who don't. And gone are the days of people should just come to work and get on with it and stop moaning.
Yeah, quite right. I'm with you. I think one thing that people need to take into account, you may end up in this pool of, okay, what if my culture or what if the leadership, etc., is not willing to change, is you don't have to put up and shut up and deal with it. Because a lot of what I find in practice is people almost sort of do their best and then wait until mental health is quite bad, or the eating is not right, sleep is not right, health is not right, when something could have been done so much further back. Although indeed it's almost natural to try and hold out as long as possible. You don't want to be seen as a problem, and so on, until it gets to a point where you just snap. And the purpose of this, I'm not doing myself out of a job, but the purpose of this is very much prevention is better than cure in this respect.
And I think also people, I'd always encourage people to have a conversation with whoever they feel comfortable with. So if you don't feel like your line manager is the right person who you can ask those questions to, or try out a new idea with, or whatever, go and find someone you can. So it's about finding someone you can connect with to start with, so to help gain confidence in terms of what you are going to say, or just get someone else's perspective. And also remembering that sometimes, I know I've worked with people who want to do the right thing, and actually deep down their values are actually pretty sound values. But in terms of when they get into their particular role, they almost kind of put on a different coat, and it's almost like, right, I need to be this person who's in control, or who's kind of telling people what they should be doing, and I've got this pressure coming down me. I was talking to someone earlier on about middle management roles. They've got this pressure coming down them, and they've got to pass that on to their team. Some managers are great at holding that back, and some people just shove it on down. And it's understanding that some people is not a personal thing. They didn't get it right. So actually they might not have the confidence or the skills or know-how how to communicate well and how to build trust and relationships and so on.
Right. I'll read out this next question. It says, what are your thoughts on training like unconscious bias training and psychological safety? Are there employment law considerations that need to be made if a staff member is deeply unhappy with training offered? Should we split that into two, perhaps? So Lisa, what are your thoughts on training like unconscious bias training and psychological safety?
I think training about anything, only fits if it fits within the wider culture, and it only fits if it's then followed through, so it's actually modelled in day-to-day practice. So I see too often people being kind of sent off in different courses, or they get an external person in to run one workshop, and then they're expecting like magic things to happen. And then when it doesn't, there's this whole like, well, that wasn't very good, was it? Whereas actually, I think training, I think raising awareness is really good, but I think it needs to be raising awareness in terms of, firstly, people need to be aware of psychological safety and unconscious bias and a whole host of needs, but they need to be aware and they need to be helped to actually apply that to their own practice. So in my specific role, how do I feedback, or how do I ask questions? What is my platform for doing that? How do I, we talk about conversations and check-ins. Where do I make time for that? Have I got time for that? Or is my line manager basically putting so much pressure on me to fill my time with, do my kind of, whatever my other role is, kind of the more practical side of it. I don't have time to connect with people. So it's actually about applying it to my own practice and then going away and having a go at what we learned from training, and then coming back and being able to reflect on, actually, this worked really well. I got these amazing results, but actually this didn't work well at all. I didn't really understand that bit when I tried to do it. So I think with any training, some stats I was reading recently that up to 98% of training can be lost after training if it's not put into practice, if it's not utilized. There's got to be, it's no good going along to something and then, straight after this, like, think about the way you are today, right now. How many of you, as soon as you click leave this webinar, are going to park this and go straight back to whatever your day job is? How many of you are actually going to think, okay, what difference is this going to make? What are the 3 things I'm actually going to make sure I do differently, whether it's having a conversation with someone or checking in with someone, or, how am I going to put this on the agenda? And we tend to be very good at going, well, I'm going to read this book, or I'm just going to have this conversation, or listen to a podcast, or attend a webinar. But it's got to have the intention, it's got to be the conscious effort to then put that into practice. And it's got to be supported as part of that bigger culture. So it's a really long way of answering my little bit of that question, Roy.
No, quite right. I'm with you. And in fact, in many ways, it feeds into what I was thinking in terms of an answer. That you won't believe the amount of clients who say, oh yeah, but we had this training in the company, but no one did anything about it. No one put it into practice. It almost does a company more harm if you have the training and then do not put it into practice. Because in fact, you then have employees who come along and I'll say, well, that's brilliant for your claim. Let's whack that in the claim form as well. And that ought to be one of the last things that leaders and managers will want. So I would dare say there aren't necessarily employment law considerations per se that you need to consider, because if the training is done right, there ought not to be any employment law issues that come up. But practically speaking, take on board what Lisa has said. Have your one-to-ones with your staff, with those who might prefer that, or have open sessions. More staff will respond better if things are done anonymously than, okay, everyone, put your hand up if you agree that the company hasn't got a very good culture in, or anything like that, or what needs to change, or what can you say about your line manager. Most people would be more open to give real, tangible, practical, honest feedback if you did things in more of an anonymous way, is what I would suggest. All right, next one. So yes, agree, Lisa. Any thoughts, tangible ideas on how to embed learnings from a program or training into day-to-day?
So in terms of how to embed it, that comes, if you're looking at essentially how to embed the training that you've had, whether it's from points you picked up today or from anything else, I always start off with the sense of getting your team together. So not trying to do it on your own, but getting your team together, whoever is relevant, whoever that comprises, and to sit down and actually work out what resonates with people. Because not everything that's going to be shared in any training is going to be relevant. It doesn't going to fit with it's not going to fit with your values, or it's not going to fit with your particular context. So it's finding out what resonates with you, and then finding out what are the things, there might be some quick wins, or what are the things that fit well with the culture already that you can do more of. And it's that sense of, what do we need to change? What do we need to inform people about? What do we need to get people's opinions on? Going back to my scale right at the start, the 1 to 10, actually, do we even know where we are right now? So if we're thinking about embedding something, we've got to know our starting point. And only when you know where you're starting from, can you then start to work out, okay, these are some of the ideas I've got, how do they fit in? Because you can't be doing everything at once either. You've got to be really, really realistic. about it's one step at a time. Otherwise it becomes overwhelming. And it almost feels like here's a new initiative and everything's being thrown at us. And then it all becomes too overwhelming. It's not manageable. And then there's no follow through. And so it gets kind of dropped. And that's where people can get quite skeptical about, change being real. Like, are people going to follow through on what they say they're going to follow through? How serious? Is this, are we picking up on psychological safety because it's the buzzword at the moment? Or is it because actually someone really believes in it? And that's where we need to sit down, and it's starting off with, what are your values? What's the purpose? How does everything you're finding out about on your course, whatever that course is about, fit with your purpose and your values and your vision? And then what are the first steps to take towards sort of moving along that scale?
Yeah, I'm with you. Thank you. All right, there are no further
questions. I've
Sorry,
got a
yes.
question. Sorry, I'm camera shy today. But I just want to ask from personal experience as well. I think that promoting psychological safety, especially for managers, can be difficult in striking that balance between the staff having a good rapport and getting on, and this whole culture of banter, workplace banter. Again, this is from personal experience, and how that can impede those who want to speak up about their psychological safety, because there's this kind of, everyone wants to have like a good relationship, but I think lines can be crossed. How best to kind of overcome that?
Yeah, I'm happy. I can comment first on that, and I don't know if you've got something to say than Roy. I know I worked at a company last year who had a similar issue. They said about, banter. There were some people who'd been this company forever, and they some of what they said wasn't quite so PC, and that banter was for some people causing quite a lot of offence. And again, we had that situation of having to say, having to kind of create. It wasn't about dealing with that directly to start with. It's about being able to be honest and open with each other about day-to-day stuff. And it being received well. So it comes back to the whole model of feedback and whole model of having genuine conversations where people can be honest and open and authentic. And then empower people to say, actually, you know what, when you say that, I feel uncomfortable. I don't feel comfortable with that. So it's not a, you shouldn't be saying that and kind of pointing the finger and blame, but it's a sense of, I don't feel comfortable. And if you've got, this goes back to this whole model of having almost an agreed model of how we feedback and how we communicate with each other that can be held accountable to. Because if, as part of psychological safety, if anyone's saying anything or doing anything that makes someone else feel uncomfortable, then that's where someone should be able to speak up and say, and it's not about, you shouldn't be doing that. It's about, I actually don't feel very comfortable with that happening. And then that's where it's about the other person taking that on board and understanding that, okay, that's not the right, this is not the right place to have that banter. It might be okay with my mates who have the same values and the same kind of opinions and everything as me outside of work, but this is not a place that's okay. I don't know what you would add to that, Roy.
Yeah, quite right. Really agree. And I think the lines get even more blurred where you might have a kind of setting of communication which is outside work. So when it's at work, it's kind of straightforward. But if you've got a WhatsApp group or some other kind of group session outside of work, where things happen or things are said and there's banter so-called, or things which someone might view as discriminatory, etc. It reminds me of a case I had where there were a group of lads in a WhatsApp group, and then a woman joined that group or was added into that group as well. And very long story short, some of the texts were stones would blush. It was bad by any measure of comparison. And she had spoken up from time to time to one of her manager who actually happened to be in this WhatsApp group as well and happened to be one of the proponents of it, to say, actually, I don't feel really comfortable with these images or videos that you're sharing or things like that. And it was just, don't worry about it. Like, you're part of the team now. This is what we do. We've been doing this for years. There's no pressure. And very unsurprisingly, she, of course, became a very self-conscious, anxious individual. And she eventually raised it to other managers who eventually dealt with that and dealt with it the right way. There are about 7 of the guys in that group who all eventually got dismissed. But it just goes to show that perhaps it's not always so straightforward as, oh, this is just the workplace, because there are lots of things that happen outside that. And it's important for employees not to think that they have got free reign, as it were, outside that. I think you mentioned a good point, Lisa. If it's in a setting where, yes, you're with your mates, you all kind of do and believe the same thing, that's of course up to you, whatever you do in your private life. But where you have this sometimes unfortunately blurred line between what's work and what's not, and someone actually raises an issue, it doesn't matter if they're on side with you until at one point they go, actually, guys, I know I was with you for like the past few months or so and I joined in, but right now I'm feeling quite uncomfortable. It's important to be alive to that and make the right changes, not to just dismiss it.
Roy, I'm aware of time, which has run out, unsurprisingly. Can I don't know what the best suggestion would be to do with questions. And there are other questions that we haven't addressed yet. And I'm just wondering whether if people would like to still have questions answered, then they might think about a few to direct them out, or just send us an email to both of us to ask the question, then we can come back to you with some advice. So as I said right at the start, this is very much an introduction to a very, very big topic. And this is about starting a conversation. So Roy and I are very happy to continue having the conversations with you offline. We'd like you to start having the conversations, or continue if you've already started, with your colleagues, and just see what comes up. And I think as long as people have a kind of, it's that growth mindset I think you referred to earlier, Roy, about just that sense of trying it, having a go, saying actually what does this mean to everyone else, and what do we want to do, and what's the first step. It's not about getting it perfect, it's just about starting the journey. So I'd like to thank everyone for coming along today, and for asking lots of questions, and for joining us. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.